Okay, so we've covered the pre-modern period and then we covered the modern period. But before going into the postmodern thought, um, I mentioned that we need to spend some time discussing the atheist perspective because of the dominance that the atheist perspective has had for the past century or so within the realm of academia. So we've mentioned a little bit about it. We mentioned that they've made there's been some philosophical mistakes that were made, but we need to go into it a little bit further. All right, so we started off with the idea that the atheistic rationale is built on the foundationalist um, thought process. This idea of a minimalist beginning that essentially, you have this foundation that is solid, and then you have this layer of minimal assumptions that you need to make just to be able to have any kind of rationality. And then from that point on, the only thing that can be considered knowledge is scientific evidence, scientific knowledge. Now, when it comes to the question of God, the way this is applied is the concept of God is treated as a claim, just a random independent claim, and it needs the burden to demonstrate this claim is on the people making it. And in order to address it, because the claim is an extraordinary claim, I mean, some kind of being that is omniscient, omnipotent, and all this stuff is it's a fairly extraordinary claim. It requires serious evidence, but the only acceptable kind of evidence is scientific evidence. And I mentioned that the in order to even get to this place, you need to have this properly basic beliefs, the existence of other minds, the world, and memory. And so in other words, the way I've addressed it is to say that in order to have even the foundation for an atheist rationality, you have to make certain assumptions. The fact that other minds exist, the fact that the world exists, the fact that memory exists, and all that stuff. So there's a set of basic beliefs that everybody has to hold. And in order to have those beliefs, you automatically have to have also some explanation for why those things exist. Why is it that even I, as the individual, since Descartes' whole system is based on the self, on the existence of the self. Why do I exist? How do I exist? How does the world exist? All these different things. These are questions, and their explanation is automatically a properly basic belief, because otherwise there's no reason for them to be there. Okay, so there's three possible explanations. I mean, there's millions of explanations, but we could synthesize them into these three categories. This basic set of elements that we take for granted, either they developed on their own through some natural process, either they were intentionally created by some mind, or something in between, something that doesn't quite qualify as a mind, but it's not a natural process either. So some type of supernatural force, some type of supernatural element but that isn't something that can be seen as a mind. So these are the three possibilities. So essentially it's naturalism. There's three hypotheses. One is naturalism, one is theism, and one is non-theistic supernaturalism. And these three hypotheses together, unless the atheists and whoever, however they label themselves naturalists, unless they can demonstrate that the naturalist hypothesis is the correct one, these three hypotheses are all in play. And together as a whole, they're properly basic in the sense that we have to assume that one of the three is correct in order for all these other things to be able to be taken for granted, which become a basis for every other type of belief we hold. And any kind of scientific knowledge that is acquired has to be built on top of this layer that is assumed based on these three hypotheses. Okay, so essentially the atheistic rationale that has dominated academia for over a century is flawed at its core, and somehow it in trying to address this, people that have kind of contradicted this never really addressed the actual flaw, but have attempted to address it in other ways, and it hasn't been successful. Okay, now I want to continue on through this presentation with some of the typical arguments and objections that atheists bring up, but I have a certain way of addressing them, and in order to do this, I need to introduce a caveat first, and this is what this is that the majority of theists that approach these issues approach them with a metaphysical blind spot, and it's usually because of their dualistic view of reality. And there's several components here. So the first thing is liberal Christians. Now, liberal Christianity developed as a reaction to modernity at a time when it just didn't seem like there was a way to justify Christian belief. So the way they've approached it, first of all, their whole epistemology is based on something very basic to human experience. So they've avoided having to rely on any kind of authority, any kind of revealed religion. They've based their entire perspective on something very simple, which is this core sense of dependence that supposedly everyone has, or at least the majority of people have, and they're born with, and they develop throughout their lives. But the other component to liberal Christianity, or another one of its features, is that they realized that Christians made certain assumptions about the natural world, where they felt that part of it was done by natural mechanical physical processes, and other parts were done by God. And as science progressed, the part that was played by God was getting smaller and smaller. So this idea of the God of the gaps argument developed, and liberal Christians wanted to avoid for Christianity to always be within this God of the gaps situation. And the way they did is to say, look, let's just imagine that naturalists come up with an entire explanation of reality from beginning to end, and it's purely natural. Okay, so everything has a natural explanation, all of existence. Let's just imagine that. Well, God could still exist, and God could actually be behind all this and be the reason this whole natural process happens. Okay, so then they develop this idea that everything that happens is natural, but everything that happens is also a miracle. So it's all supernatural and natural in a sense, because God is behind it, even though from our point of view, it's natural from beginning to end. So essentially, every natural thing is a miracle at the same time as it is natural. And this is essentially a theological bias of liberal Christianity, which affects the way they interact with the atheist community or the naturalist community, and the way they reason through the arguments of the naturalists. So this is one group, the liberal Christians, and their tendency to claim that everything is natural from beginning to end and supernatural at the same time. So that's one view. Another view is the views of the typical dualist views of Christians. So whether this has to do with pantheists, and I know pantheism is usually considered a monist view, but I'm saying that there's this perception that there's the natural or the material world, but the material world is part of God. So in other words, it's kind of supernatural as well. So either the pantheist view, the panentheist view, or the traditional dualisms like Platonic. There's essentially three versions of dualism. There's Platonic, Aristotelian, and Cartesian. We talked about the Platonic dualism, where there's a material layer and an immaterial layer to reality. Aristotelian dualism, the hylomorphism, where we have individual components, individual objects have a material and an immaterial component. Cartesian dualism is mostly about the mind. So basically, it's either the mind or matter. So it's kind of a different distinction. And what I'm saying here doesn't apply as much to Cartesian dualism as the others. But any of these perspectives also have a problem with the natural supernatural distinction. And they tend to adapt to science by saying, okay, back during pre-modern times, we used to think that a small fragment of reality was natural and a larger fragment was supernatural. So the second layer to reality, the immaterial layer. But now we realize that a lot more of it was natural, but the other stuff, there's still the supernatural component that is behind the scenes. So in other words, by increasing one layer and decreasing the other, dualists tend to adapt to scientific advancement without fully confronting the reality from the perspective of the scientist, the perspective of the naturalist who develops that science. So what I'm gonna try to continuously remind listeners as they go through this presentation is to try to put on atheist naturalist glasses as they think through everything I'm saying in this presentation. If in fact they either come from the liberal perspective or they come from one of these dualistic views where there's reality is part God or part immaterial and all this, to try to step out of that and imagine the world from a naturalist perspective, where everything is mechanical, everything is material from beginning to end, as we reason to the rest of the steps. Anyway, so now I'm gonna first present a series of analogies, and then I'm gonna come back at the end and bring everything together and explain how it all affects the atheist epistemology, and because of this its dominance in academia, why we need to address this before we move on to the final step, which is the postmodern epistemology. All right, so here's the first analogy. This is the analogy that I call the analogy of the concrete room. Okay, so imagine that for whatever reason, one day you wake up and you're not at home where you went to bed, you wake up in this concrete room. It's this massive room. It's maybe the size of a Walmart, and it's surrounded by walls all around. There's no doors, no windows. There's no dirt on the ground. It's all cement on the ground. It's completely connected to the walls, connected to the cement ceiling, all the way around this huge room with a very high ceiling, and there's no opening or break anywhere. In the wall is all the way around, and you're stuck in this room, and you just wake up and you have no idea how you got there, and there you are. So the question is, what can you know in this situation? So the first option you have, and there's two ways that you approach or you try to develop some kind of knowledge about your situation. The first thing is empirical, which means you try to walk around the room and check the walls to see if there's any opening, to see if there's any way to break through, to see if there's any weakness in the walls, any holes, anything you could look through outside. So you try to see if there's a way to see outside through some kind of opening, but you do your examination, there's no opening in the wall anywhere, there's nothing you could see. You put your ear to the wall, you try to listen, you don't hear anything. You don't smell anything. Essentially, every sense that you try gives you absolutely no information about where you are. So that's one way of knowing. The second way of knowing is using your mind and trying to postulate about what could possibly be happening here. So you might come up with some hypothesis. You might say, well, maybe I'm kidnapped for ransom and they're just storing me here for a while. You might say, well, maybe this is some kind of weird scientific experiment and somebody's putting me here to see how I'm going to react over time or whatever. Maybe this is some kind of sadistic game show where people are entertaining themselves by watching me here to see how I survive in this situation. And so on. So you come up with some possible or plausible alternative scenarios. Now, somebody might say this is not knowledge, but this is more you're in a better position to come up with these hypothetical situation or this plausible scenarios than not having anything at all, because at least the scenarios give you something to expect or to look forward to, or something to some way to reason through the situation. So you might say, okay, well, this is a scientific experiment. That means maybe I'm being observed. That means people are probably going to try to um, provide me with food at some point, because otherwise the experiment will finish too quickly or whatever, and so on. If this is a ransom situation, if I'm kidnapped, then somebody's gonna eventually provide the ransom and I'll be out of here and so on. So the ability to postulate, to use your mind to or your imagination to think about possible scenarios is actually, you're in a better situation than having nothing at all. But it's still limited because you don't know if you've considered all the possible alternatives, and you don't know which of these alternatives is true, if any, right? So these are the options you have: your senses and your reason. And your senses can only provide limited information. In this situation, they have nothing. They give you nothing because there's no access to anything. And your reason, it can only speculate and give you some plausible scenarios. And beyond that, you're stuck. That's all you can do. And essentially, you have nothing more that you could learn about your situation at that point in time. So I'm using this analogy to introduce the idea that human beings have epistemic limitations, and there's serious epistemic limitations. There's certain things they can learn, and if their processes by which they learn are limited by something or blocked by something, then they don't have a way to go beyond that. Okay. Now, imagine that the person that kidnapped you and put you in here is outside the room. They don't have the same limitations as you do. So if they, for example, decide to communicate with you, like maybe they have speakers mounted somewhere in the ceiling, and they decide to give you information about why you're here and what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish, then that is a source of knowledge coming from the outside in that you don't have from the inside in. So the epistemic limitation is a one-way limitation. You have the limitation going out trying to learn uh, things about your situation, but if somebody is outside, they don't have the same limitation going back in. Okay. All right, so that's one analogy. I'm going to switch completely and start talking about something else. This is another kind of analogy, and I'll bring this together later as we continue this. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about this idea of a virtual universe. Now, again, I'm asking the listener to assume that naturalism is true. Okay, so the naturalist is correct. There's no God, there's no supernatural. Everything happened naturally. If you trace it back, maybe there's a big bang, maybe there's something before that started, but it's all natural from beginning to end. Okay, if that's the case, the possibility exists that as we continue to study reality, at some point we'll get to where we have an understanding of all about how the universe works. I mean, we've made significant scientific progress in the past 200 years. If we could continue at this pace, who knows where we'll get another 500 or 1,000 years from now, especially now that we have computers to help with the process. So maybe at some point, we're going to get a complete understanding of how the universe works and how it originated from beginning to end. Okay. Now, not just this, but at some point we could come to the place where we could have a full understanding of how the human brain works and how the human mind functions. Because if we're dealing with the naturalist perspectives, there's no soul, there's no immaterial component, there's no God. It's all like our ability to be self-aware and all this stuff, it's all the result of the brain. So within the naturalist paradigm, assuming science can continue, and there's no reason to think it couldn't, at some point we're going to come to understand how the mind works, and we're going to come to a point where we could understand how the universe works. Okay, and if that is the case, it logically follows that we could at some point develop a simulated reality on a computer where we could do things exactly the way they are in a real world. So we can fully duplicate our reality within a simulated reality on a computer. So what does this mean? It means that we can create a universe, a virtual universe, where objects in the universe are made of atoms, where there's intelligent entities, but those intelligent entities have their intelligence not because of the computer uh, uh, essentially running their minds for them, but they have intelligence because they have virtual brains that are made of virtual molecules, which are made of virtual atoms and so on, just like our human brains. And it is because of this that they develop their intelligence. And it's because of this that they can function within this virtual reality. And again, if we're looking at this from the naturalist perspective, all this stuff is logically possible because the entire universe is mechanistic. And if it's mechanistic, we can replicate that on the computer. There's no reason why we couldn't replicate that on a computer. Okay. So the question then is, if within a naturalist paradigm, remember, naturalism is one of the three hypotheses we're working with. So within the naturalist paradigm, it is logically sensible to assume that at some point, somebody will be able to develop a computer that simulates our reality exactly to the point where entities could exist in the computer that could be in the exact same predicament we are. Okay, so they would be in this virtual universe and they wouldn't know why they're there, and they would develop their own scientific methodology, and they would study the world and come to hopefully to similar conclusions that we're coming about our world by studying our world. And the question is, if that could happen to them, how do we know that we're not in a simulated reality that was built by a previous naturalist reality? Okay, so again, we're assuming naturalism is correct, but we could be a replica of a previous reality, of previous naturalist existence that developed us on the computer. Okay, so we could call this the secondary reality. How do we know which is the secondary reality, ours or the one that we've created? And the question is, what would be a scientific test to determine if we're in a secondary or a primary existence? All right. And we can apply that to ourselves, but we could apply it to the beings within our simulated reality. So if we say, okay, here's a scientific test that we've developed to determine if this is a simulated reality or a primary reality, all right? And we run this test, and these are the particular results that we get from running this test. And we say like, okay, this is not a simulated reality, this is the primary reality. Then why couldn't we replicate those results so that when the entities in our simulated reality ran their test, their scientific test, they would get those same results and then decide, oh no, this is not a simulated reality, this is a primary reality. Anyway, hopefully the complication here is clear, that by the very nature of how naturalism views reality, it could actually be itself a secondary reality. It could be part of a created reality that was built by a previous naturalist group of people, or whatever you would call them. Okay. Now this concept, so I'm gonna use the terminology simulated reality model. This concept is a very useful concept in atheist conversations because it provides us a model to say, okay, let's test our ideas about what it would be like to have some kind of, for our world to have a supernatural component to it. Okay. And for example, an atheist might say, if the supernatural exists, it wouldn't be able to interact with our natural world. Okay, so let's test that on this SRM model, right? If we create an SRM, would we as programmers be able to interact with it? And if so, why couldn't we be in a reality where someone else could interact with our reality? Some supernatural entity could interact with our reality. So anyway, this idea is very useful for theist-atheist interactions. But at this point, I'm not really concerned with that. I'm just presenting this as something else to consider when we think about the naturalist paradigm and the fact that within the naturalist paradigm, there's this logical possibility of a sub-reality even within the naturalist paradigm. Okay, so moving on. Okay, now one of the key elements of science is that there's this dogma that is central to the scientific process, which is known as methodological naturalism. And methodological naturalism is different than philosophical naturalism, because in philosophical naturalism, it is a claim about how reality actually is. So somebody who sees themselves as a naturalist, they're making a claim about reality being natural from beginning to end. Methodological naturalism, however, is not saying anything about the way reality actually is. It's just saying that this is an assumption we're making while doing science. Whether reality is this way or not, we're just going to assume it is material. I mean, it is natural, yeah, material, so that we can conduct our science. Now, unfortunately, within religious circles, a lot of people are very much opposed to methodological naturalism, but it's very difficult to get rid of it because of the nature of how the scientific process works. Now, science, the way it studies the world is by making testable predictions. And when you make predictions, you have to be able to understand what are the implications of those predictions and how things would happen if your predictions were true. So you could say, okay, I'm studying something about the world. I see the effects, so then I'm going to predict and say, okay, I think the reason these things are happening is because this particular version of reality is correct. Well, if that version of the reality is correct, then I can predict XYZ should be the consequence of that, and I should be able to discover that. And then I go do my experiments and I determine if my predictions are fulfilled. And if not, then my initial hypothesis was wrong. But the problem is, if you allow for the supernatural in anywhere in that process, you cannot make any predictions because you have no idea how the supernatural would interact with the natural world. It is a loose radical, so to speak. It is an unpredictable component that makes the entire process fall apart. So methodological naturalism is critical to how people go about their scientific process. But that being the case, there's some problems with this process in terms of how it would react in a reality where such a thing as a supernatural exists. So one of the first things that an atheist would say, if I made the claim, like let's say what I just said right now, in that I took the claim that science has a difficulty with the supernatural, if the supernatural existed, an atheist would reply and say, no, the scientific process is perfectly capable of addressing supernatural claims. And the example they'll give you and say, the examples that they'll give would be intercessory prayer. And they'll say, like, look, prayer is a supernatural claim. I could take intercessory prayer and I could convert it to a scientific experiment, and I could follow the entire scientific process here. I could have a large sample size. I could have tens of thousands of people for which somebody's praying. I could have control groups. I could have the placebos, in a sense that some people think somebody's praying for them and they're not. I could create a double-blind experiment. I have randomness, data collection, all this stuff. This entire process can be applied to something supernatural, like intercessory prayer, and it has already been done. And if, in fact, this thing worked, science would be able to tell us that it works, and therefore science is perfectly capable of addressing supernatural claims. And that's true. But there's a very limited sphere within which this works. Okay, so now I want to consider another analogy, which I call the ultimate resurrection analogy. And the reason I usually work with this one is because for at least within the Christian community, the resurrection of Christ is oftentimes used as some kind of evidence for Christianity. Okay. And what I want to say is there's a hypothetical situation that I can conceive that is a much stronger evidence than what the resurrection of Christ could be. Okay. So let's say that instead of 2,000 years ago, we went back only 1,000 years. And let's say that instead of somewhere in some random place in the world, away from civilization and surrounded by poor people and people that are, maybe illiterate or whatever, in Galilee and Judea and all that, where Jesus lived and died, let's say this happened somewhere in the center of the whatever empire exists at that point in time in our hypothetical scenario. So let's just say there's an emperor has a massive empire, and he calls together a gathering of the elite of all the different nations that are under his control, and brings people from many different countries in, and it's all the most highly educated, the leaders, the elite of society, right? So these are not poor fishermen, these are not shepherds and people that don't know what they're talking about, or others might assume that they're uneducated, so they could be easily duped. It's the height of society, and he brings all these people together for some kind of gathering. And let's imagine it happens in some big stadium-like place, like maybe the Colosseum or something like that. Okay, and during this meeting, at some point, this emperor decides to, in order to, show, give a show of strength, or however you want to justify it, he decides to take a group of people and to publicly decapitate them. And I'm saying decapitation because at least there we know for sure we're dead. With the crucifixion, somebody might look like they died, but they might still be alive. So these people are definitely dead because their heads have been chopped off. And it has happened publicly in front of thousands of people that are, the best society has to offer at that point in time. And let's say that they sit there, in public for hours and hours as different presentations take place and different events occur within this gathering. And after several hours, somehow the heads reconnect with the bodies of these people and they come back to life and everybody sees it. Okay. So here's a scenario that avoids a lot of the problems that people see with the crucifixion and death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, because it's a much more public situation, a lot more higher ranked people are observing the thing. The individuals have definitely died. They come back to life. Everybody sees it, as opposed to just a few people here and there seeing the resurrected bodies and all this stuff, right? So we fixed a lot of the problems that people might point to the resurrection of Jesus. And let's just say that the festivities or the gathering ends, and all these people from from the different countries go back and they tell everybody what happened, and they write well-preserved records, so that today, 1,000 years later, when archaeologists go to all these different countries and they go through their records, they find descriptions of the event from thousands of different people that are well documented, and they all harmonize, and it perfectly supports the idea that this actually happened. Okay, even in that situation, scientists looking back at that event will still find other alternatives to the resurrection as being more probable. Why? Because of this inner logic of how science work, which is based in methodological naturalism, where you're always looking for a natural explanation for stuff. So they might say, okay, maybe this was some kind of magician trick, maybe people were drugged, maybe people had some kind of hallucination, maybe maybe the people that were executed had twins, and they were all resurrected. It was actually the twins. Whatever, there's always some alternative explanation that is a better explanation than that an actual resurrection happened. In order for science to take the idea of the resurrection seriously, that event would have to happen under controlled experimental conditions. So if they could take this execution and subsequent resurrection and put it within this process here, scientific rigor, with a large sample size, control group, placebo, double blind, all this stuff, and make it reproducible and do it all over and then demonstrate that it happens, then it would be scientifically valid. But without that, there's always some alternative that is more plausible. So essentially what I'm saying that I'm taking Hume's argument against miracles and I'm turning it upside down. And I'm saying like, no, this is actually an argument against the naturalist perspective because it demonstrates its epistemic limitations. Okay, it shows that there's a problem with this epistemic rationale that even in a situation where something serious like this, like a major supernatural event, if it had happened, and let's just say in this scenario, we know for sure that it happened, science would always take some alternative explanation as being better than this. Okay. And what this tells us is that there is a flaw with this process, with the scientific method, and he has this bias against the supernatural. Now, this is just an example, but we can go back throughout the history of the world, and we could say there could be many things that occurred, over the development of the universe, where there could have been supernatural components where science would never discover them because it's always looking for a natural explanation, and the natural explanation is always more favorable. So, for example, this is just an example, so I don't want to get hung up on this, but abiogenesis is one element within the biological sciences that doesn't really have a solution at this moment in time. So that's one area where we could say, well, that's something that could have had be the result of some sort of supernatural interference, and yet science would never consider that. It would always look for alternative explanations. Now, I'm trying to decide which of these should go first. So the point of this, okay, so let me introduce this and then I'll bring it together in the next slide. So coming back to this process here that I described as scientific rigor, where you have a large sample size, control group, placebo, blah, all these different things that scientists do that give a high level of credibility to the scientific process. Imagine that we started with a small sample size and we eventually increased it, because obviously, like, even if you're running an experiment with 100,000 people, you gather your data in sequence. I mean, you don't get all your results at once. So at the beginning, you might only have a few results, and over time, you get the rest of them. When you have a few results, your level of certainty is relatively small. So there's, like, let's say you get from 0 results to 100,000 results. Over here at 0, you have relative uncertainty regarding whatever it is you're testing. As your results increase, you get to this yellow area where you could be relatively confident that things are working properly, but you're not 100% certain yet, or even close to 100% certain, because things could still go wrong. But then as your data collection increases, you get to a level where you have sufficient evidence to be highly certain. It's never 100%, but you could be highly certain that whatever it is you're testing, your results are correct. So when it comes to science, there's this increase in certainty based on the amount of evidence you can collect. Not just this, but a lot of times in science, there's different components are interconnected and they rely on each other. So in order for some elements to be true, the other elements surrounding them that are buttressing that one element, they also have to be true. But unfortunately, we don't always have the capacity to address them all, to have the same level of confidence in all of them at once. So some of them might be in the relative certainty area, the green. Others you might have workable confidence, while others you're relatively uncertain. And yet other ideas or other components of your knowledge structure are interdependent and rely on each other. Okay, so these are just some aspects of how science works. Okay, so with that said, coming back to coming back to where we were with the idea that was presented on the under the ultimate resurrection stuff. So we talked about how science has this tendency to always assume natural explanations, even if in a situation something supernatural definitely happened, right? So the way science goes about it about anything is it comes up with a naturalistic hypothesis. So let's just say we have some question. We're trying to figure out how something happened throughout the history of the universe. So we come up with a hypothesis, and that hypothesis is always going to be naturalistic. That hypothesis allows us to make predictions. So we do research and we gather data, and we evaluate the data and we say, okay, were the predictions confirmed? Then if yes, then our certainty increases to some degree, but we go back and repeat this process and we do more research, gather more data, and we continue to increase our certainty. If the data does not confirm our hypothesis, we go back to the beginning and we come up with a second hypothesis, but it's also naturalistic. So even if we have to get rid of this naturalistic hypothesis, we got to come up with another one that's also naturalistic. And however it happens, if with the passing of time and with the gathering of data, something comes to the point where it's falsified, then we go back and we switch to another naturalistic hypothesis. If it's confirmed and we continue to increase our confidence, then that's fine. But it is not always possible to reach that high level of confidence that I've marked with a green color. Okay. But how do we ever get to concluding that something is supernatural using the scientific process? And again, I'm talking about a hypothetical scenario where something supernatural definitely happened. If we're studying that using science, how would we ever get there? The only way we would ever get there is if we could somehow exhaust all the natural possibilities. So we try one hypothesis, we try the other, and we try every imaginable hypothesis, and we could come to the conclusion that we've tried everything and there's nothing else possible. Then we could say, okay, well, then maybe that's supernatural. That's the only option left over. But there isn't some kind of intrinsic process by which the scientific methodology would ever naturally arrive at the supernatural option unless you would be under controlled experimental conditions, like I mentioned when we were talking about intercessory prayer. All right. Now, the problem with this whole thing is obviously, first of all, one problem is that there's never a situation in real life where we exhaust all the naturalistic hypotheses. We could always come up with something else. And if we cannot come up with anything else, then we just say, well, maybe we cannot do it now, but 200, 300 years, 1,000 years down the line, when science advances, maybe then we'll figure it out. So we could always delay and say, we've exhausted all our naturalistic hypotheses now, but we just have to wait. We'll just wait around for another 500 years, and then maybe we'll come up with a different one then. So we don't give up and say we're done with all the possibilities. We're going to switch over to supernatural. That never happens in real life. Another thing is that might be even worse is that sometimes we come to a situation where we enter this yellow zone and we say, okay, we do have a workable hypothesis. And the problem is that eventually that hypothesis will prove to be incorrect, will prove to be falsified, but it will probably take us 500 years before we reach the level where we could either confirm it, we could either enter the green area, or we could say, no, it was falsified, so we have to try something else. So we end up dealing with this we end up operating at this workable level where we think something works, but in fact, it doesn't, because it actually was supernatural. And we're not even looking for a solution to that, because at this moment in time, we don't have the tools to falsify this wrong hypothesis. Okay. So all these components are there, which show that the scientific process has its limitations. It is very effective at studying and understanding the world if, in fact, everything happened naturally. But if some components of reality did not happen naturally, Science is very bad at discovering that and demonstrating it, unless it can find a way to take those and put them into controlled scientific conditions, controlled experimental conditions. All right. So we talked about the three hypotheses. I've introduced all these different components and now slowly trying to bring them all together. All right. So how do atheists address this idea that naturalism, like they have this set of beliefs that they have to take for granted in order to be able to provide justification for scientific knowledge? So how do they address that? Well, the first way they address it is by ignoring the question and treating the God hypothesis as an independent claim. So God is an independent question. The burden of proof is entirely on the theist. And I already showed that that's irrational because God is not some sort of divorced element that has nothing to do with reality, but it's actually one of the three hypotheses for as an explanation for why things exist. So unless the naturalist hypothesis can be fully demonstrated, which we're nowhere near being able to do that at this point in time, and we probably won't be for a long time, all these hypotheses have to be in play unless we could somehow either disprove them or prove one of them. Okay. Now the next thing that they say is like, okay, we could grant the idea that the God claim is not an independent claim, but it's part of this couplet of three different claims which are together responsible for, or the three possibilities. But even in that case, naturalism has to be treated as the default. And their justification for this would be something like this, like, okay, everything in the world around us, when it happens, we don't think it's because of natural causes, it's because we say it's because of something natural. So if I excuse me, if I leave an object on the table and I go into the other room and come back and I find it on the floor, I could say, okay, maybe there was a small earthquake and it fell off. I could say maybe my cat came in and knocked it off the table, or my kid, or maybe something else like that. But I always think about natural explanations first. I don't sit there and think, oh, there's a ghost in my house and it's the ghost that knocked the object off the table. Or I don't come up with supernatural explanations normally. I usually prioritize natural explanations. So that's one reason why atheists will say, well, the naturalistic paradigm should be treated as the default. But there's a problem with that answer, and the problem is that they're not considering the naturalistic paradigm as a whole. For the paradigm to be treated as a default, you have to take it in its entirety, and its entirety means even going back to the very starting point. How did it all begin? If the universe came to exist on its own, how did it start? How did it begin to exist on its own? And there's a series of very unplausible scenarios, and essentially those are the only options we have to work with. So one option is something came from nothing. So for eons into the past, there was nothing, and then something suddenly came from nothing, and things moved from there. And again, so that's one possibility, but it's a very strange possibility to consider as the beginning, and it's probably no less absurd than what atheists would consider absurd, right? Another option is the infinite regress option, where something happened here because of something else that happened before it and started it, and then something else before that, and it goes endlessly into eternity. That's another something that logically is considered nonsense, but that's one of the options. Another version of the infinite regress is this the circularity option, where things just keep on going. So like this event causes this event and that event, but eventually they turn on it and the last event causes the first event. So that's another thing that's also fairly nonsensical, but it is one option for the naturalistic paradigm. Probably the most plausible of all these options is that there's something that has always existed, but this somehow at some point in time started developing the universe. So then there's questions like, okay, it always existed in the past, but then at some point on this timeline that goes infinitely in both directions, um, suddenly this became uh, started to create a universe and went from there. Why, how exactly is this explained? And then if we do go with this, is the other question is the idea of energy, because uh, the way scientists understand the universe now is that at some point, if the universe continues on long enough, um, all the energy would be used up and converted to heat, which would essentially make it to where there's nothing else that can really exist or take place, and the universe just kind of ends up in this state of lacking energy. So the question is, where did this initial energy come from, even within this idea of a universe where something has always existed, and then the universe began from there. So these are extremely difficult questions that the naturalist paradigm has to address in order to be a viable holistic paradigm or hypothesis to present to answer this question. And even if somebody could come up with an explanation, it is nowhere near a stage where it can be considered scientifically valid or scientifically confirmed, right? So the naturalistic paradigm cannot be treated as a default. It is just as much a hypothesis as all the other hypotheses. Okay, now if we move past this argument and we could get the atheists to agree that God cannot be an independent question, the naturalistic paradigm cannot be just treated as an automatic default, then the next argument would be that the naturalistic paradigm is still more probable than the others. So, okay, so that might be true. So how is that argued? One of the ways it's argued is through Occam's razor. So essentially, um, basically just saying like the naturalistic paradigm is just simpler, and it's making less claims than to say that there's an additional supernatural layer to reality. And while that might be true, Occam's razor just isn't intended to work this way. It's not really something that can be used as an argument in this setting as to say, okay, we need to treat the naturalistic hypothesis as highly probable in contrast with all these other hypotheses or the other two hypotheses simply based on Occam's razor. And as an example of this, we could use the simulated reality model I produced, I explained earlier, and we could say, okay, we could apply Occam's, like the critters inside of that simulated reality could use Occam's razor to make their argument just as much. And it doesn't really, it would be a mistake. It would lead to a mistaken conclusion, right? So Occam's razor, the benefit of Occam's razor is not as a way to prove a hypothesis like in this situation, but it's rather to like if you're in a situation where you have multiple options and one is simpler than the other, your process of testing out which hypothesis is true, you might as well start with a simple one because it's easier to demonstrate or to disprove, rather than to start with the harder ones and then figure out that those are wrong and come into a simple one. So it always makes sense to start with a simple one in an experimental type of situation. So there's a place to Occam's razor, but it doesn't really work in this context. Okay, so that's one way that atheists will argue for naturalism as being the probable hypothesis. The other way is to argue for the success of science. And what they will say is, okay, 500 years ago, people thought a lot of stuff was supernatural in the world, but then over time, science figured out natural explanations for that. So it only makes sense that eventually science will explain everything else, and there will be no need for the supernatural at all. So science if science has been able to explain so much up to now, then chances are it will continue to explain stuff until it explains everything, including some of these difficult questions that I mentioned earlier. So the success of science over the past, 200-300 years is another reason why the naturalistic hypothesis should be treated as more plausible. The problem with that is that it assumes that if a God exists and if a God contributed to our reality in some way, that he would have had to contribute at this higher level. And the fact that we've explained those things means that it's unlikely that God contributed at all. But the thing is, um, when we talk about God creating reality, there's no reason to think that God would have to create a reality that is 70% supernatural and only 30% natural. He could just as easily create a reality that is 5% supernatural and 95% natural. In other words, the idea of divine interference into reality doesn't require this extensive amount of interference. God could do only a few things and then let everything else develop on its own. And because the atheist already agrees that the whole thing could have developed on its own, it means that if God did a few things, everything else will, of course, develop on its own because the atheist agrees that's possible, right? So there's no reason to assume some degree of divine interference to begin with, so that later when we explain a lot of things naturally, we could say, oh, okay, there is a decreased probability that God is involved because we've explained all this stuff. Because we have no reason to think that God would have done those things supernaturally to begin with. Okay. So again, this is a flaw in how atheists often reason about this stuff. Okay, the final argument here it goes like this, and the question to be asked then is to say, okay, let's say we have this three hypotheses, and then the atheist will say the natural hypothesis is more probable. But the question is, how much more probable? Is it a situation where we have 99% probability for the natural and 1% for the other two? Or is it more like 66% for the natural and 33% for the other two? The reason is that if it's this more even probability, then we might say, okay, let's just accept that that is the case. Then we still have to consider that 33%, because if there's a 1/3 chance that somebody will break into your house, you're going to take that seriously. That's a significant chance, right? So 33% probability versus 66%, we can go ahead and just accept that and say, okay, even if that's the case, we still need to consider the implications of that 33%, all right? If, however, the atheist is arguing for a 99 to 1% probability here, then that's a major burden of proof that they need to adopt. So instead of saying that the burden of proof is on the theist to defend God, they're actually adopting a significant burden of proof. I mean, they have to do significant work of some kind, whether it's philosophical or scientific work, to demonstrate that the probability is that high that this is the correct hypothesis versus the others. And again, however they demonstrate this, if we remember back when we started, atheists have argued that science is the only acceptable evidence. So are they going to be able to demonstrate this scientifically, or are they actually going to rely on philosophical arguments? And if they rely on philosophical arguments, their whole trifecta kind of falls apart. Okay. All right. Now, even on top of all this, we mentioned that there's three possible hypotheses, but there's actually four. And we described the fourth one when we talked about that simulated reality model. And that's one of the reasons I was going over here. Because even if, in fact, reality is naturalistic, it's possible that we're part of a secondary reality. So even in that situation, the naturalist actually has their hypothesis or their paradigm here And that one is contrasted with three different paradigms. So he would have to say, the naturalist or the atheist would have to argue that this option is highly more plausible than all the other three combined. And those are too insignificant to take seriously. Okay. So because all these other three have an impact on the issue of science. Why? Because we've already talked about science. I'm going to come back to this argument after I address. I'm going to address one final thing here. All right. So now again, switching gears completely, but we'll come back to this later. In the original analogy that I used, I talked about this concrete room. And in this concrete room, I said that the epistemic limitation is from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Okay. Now, let's pretend that there's two people in this room. Okay. Would it be possible for the individual on the outside to reveal that they are there to one individual and not to the other? So, somehow, like, let's say maybe this is such a huge building that this individual goes and explores in this corner, this individual explores in this corner, and maybe there's a speaker here, and the guy outside says, hey, come here, I want to tell you something, but don't tell the other guy, right? It seems perfectly plausible that if somebody is outside the room, they should potentially have that capacity to communicate with one of the two individuals and not with the other. Okay. Now, again, let's just say there's 6 people in the room, or 50 or 100. The individual outside could choose to communicate with 3 of them and not with the other 3. And now it's not just that this individual has had some kind of communication with the outside, but there's others that also have had it, so they're not alone. So they could confirm their own experience of being somehow contacted from the outside with others that have had the experience, while the other 3 have never had it. And they could question and say, hey, I don't know what you heard, and I don't know what you think you know, but I've never seen anything. And when I try to ask you to prove to me that it happened, you cannot prove it to me. Okay. So what does this mean here? What this means is that there is such a thing as personal knowledge, and it has its own value, even if it's not general knowledge. Okay, so general knowledge is the kind of evidence that can be compelling to everybody. Okay, the personal knowledge is compelling to the individual, but not to everybody else. So this person could come and say, hey, I had this experience and I have this knowledge, but this person would have to take their word for it because they've never experienced that, right? And they could say, hey, your experience is valid for you, but it's not valid for me, and that's fine. So anyway, the point is that for much of modernity, the only valid form of knowledge has been general knowledge. But there's no reason for that, because there is such a thing as personal knowledge, and personal knowledge could be valid for the individual. And the fact that other individuals also have had some level of personal knowledge and they can communicate and agree that, yeah, they've had those experiences, it is an additional layer of confirmation, and it makes that there's an additional layer of validity that is given to the idea of personal knowledge, even though this cannot be used as evidence for everybody else. But it is a rational thing for this individual to hold because of their own personal experiences. Okay, so personal knowledge is yet an additional type of knowledge that has some level of validity, definitely more validity than has been acknowledged within the modern era. Okay, so now bringing all this together, we talked about how atheism has had academic dominance for much of recent history, but there's several problems with it. First is that they have this epistemic handicap, and the handicap is that because of our limitations, our only access to knowledge are our senses and our reason. Our limitations cannot let us see outside the box, so to speak. But if somebody is outside and they're trying to communicate with us, the limitation is not a two-way limitation. It's actually only our epistemic limitation. So a theist, even though they have their epistemic limits, there is a way for them to come to a fairly strong conviction that some kind of supernatural exists because this supernatural entity could communicate this way. But the atheist, because of their epistemic limitation, can never confirm that there isn't anybody out there. They can never confirm that the natural reality is all there is because of their same epistemic limitations. So there isn't this other thing out there that can communicate with them and tell them about the nature of reality. Okay, so the naturalist paradigm is epistemically handicapped. That's one thing. The second thing is that within the foundationalist positivist mentality, because of the mistakes that I mentioned earlier, they're actually just one hypothesis out of three, or actually out of four. There are four possibilities, and they just have one option out of them. And all of these together are properly basic in the sense that they have to be treated as valid options until either you disprove them all or you prove one of them. Okay. Then we talked about the limitations of science. Because of naturalistic, the methodological naturalism, science is always looking for natural explanations. So if something supernatural did happen, it wouldn't know it. The only thing science can do is somehow demonstrate that everything happened naturally with a high degree of certainty. Then we could say, yeah, everything happened naturally. But usually it takes forever. It's very hard to get there. Usually we're in this area of workable confidence, and at that point we just don't know because we don't have the method or the tools to access the supernatural if the supernatural did occur. Then I mentioned the fact that there's such a thing as personal knowledge. So the theist has an additional avenue through which they could access knowledge. And the atheist cannot deny that because the atheist cannot say whatever experience that you've had as a theist is false. There's no basis to say that because it's perfectly possible for some entity to communicate with individuals and they have every right to take that seriously, right? So the atheist has no basis to reject that as a viable source of knowledge for the theist. So they have to acknowledge that the theist could be perfectly rational because the atheist doesn't know what the other person experienced. Sure, the other person could delude themselves. That's true. That's a possibility. But they also could have experienced something genuine, and the atheist has no way to put themselves in the body and the self-awareness of that other individual to see if what they experienced was valid or not. Okay, so they cannot deny that as an additional layer of evidence for theism. So what is the impact of this? It's basically that when you take all these together, it creates a much more level playing field for theists and atheists. So after a century or more of atheistic dominance, um, if we consider all these things, the reality is that we're at a much more even level to where theism and atheism are on fairly equal footing. So there's no starting disadvantage that theists are constantly having to fight against to try to recuperate lost ground the way it's been for centuries in the epistemology, or at least for the past century or so in the epistemology of religion. Okay. And the reason things have been this way in the past is because of a series of mistakes in logic, and because the way that theists went about trying to correct those mistakes was also not the best possible approach. And I think now we have the tools to address those. And I think part of the problem is that what was needed was to really immerse ourselves in the worldview of the naturalist to understand where the flaws in the logic are, so that we can see why things were the way they were and how to correct them and how to bring things back to a more realistic philosophical platform from where we all could move forward. So anyway, this is more or less the what I consider a more realistic epistemology of atheism, that it creates a much more sound platform for beginning to develop an epistemology of religion, and we'll go from there. And we'll do that in the next episode, where we address the postmodern perspective.